Thank you very much, Terry. It is great to be back with you all again. For those of you that were here this morning, I'm glad it was good enough for you to come back, so that's a good sign. I did not have any of your Kentucky bourbon in the meantime, so that'll be after this. It is a joy to be back with you, and I'm looking forward to having some interaction tonight, so hearing from you a bit. We won't pass the mic, so I'll just repeat your questions. So just raise your hands when there's times to talk back, and feel free to share things that you have. I want it to be interactive. That's that liberal arts degree again coming in handy. I love the collective wisdom that we have in the room. So I value you as much as I value myself. So I value all of us equally. Great. So tonight, we are going to just touch very briefly. I'm going to leave probably 20 minutes for questions and response, and so to hear from you directly towards the end. So at the very beginning, so right now we're going to touch very briefly on two topics. So today, for those of you that were with us earlier this morning, we talked about the church and the symbol of church and the way that that functions and why it's important. So because the way that we think about the church informs how we think about ourselves in the world. And if you didn't catch that, you can catch it on your website here at FCC Louisville. But tonight we're going to touch on the other two topics that I think are really important in the life of faith, which is God, believe it or not, and the Bible. So I think those three aspects of faith, church, God, and the Bible, are oftentimes, those are the three, the Trinity that's used against gay people in particular, but also against other groups throughout history. And I think we've seen that throughout Christian history, seeing those three especially used against groups that are deemed different. So we're going to unpack those a bit. As you can see, the title is Day of Deconstruction, or Evening of Deconstruction in this case. And deconstruction, it's not necessarily that I'm taking a sledgehammer to anyone's faith, but that we're going to carefully pull some of the threads of the tapestry of faith and hopefully not unravel the whole thing. But, some of my clothes are getting old because I wear the same things all the time, and you got to cut some of the threads off of the buttons sometimes. Wow, that was a really lame metaphor, but I'm glad. So tonight we're going to talk about first thing we're going to talk about is God. And for those of you that don't know, though, I'm JJ. I'm glad to be here. Pam and Rachel, who I had the privilege of having dinner with last night, great members here, recommended that for context, it would be helpful for you to know that there's a video that happened to go viral or something about me 2 years ago at the Methodist Church conference, which is, I'm a Methodist. And so 2 years ago, a video went viral of me speaking at the United Methodist Global Assembly, where we make rules of how we'll be the church for the next 4 years, usually. And so at that conference, I shared some of my testimony as a gay person who feels called to ministry in the church and challenging the ways that our church continues to not include LGBTQ people. And a few people saw it on the internet, and now I get to come to cool places like this in Louisville. So that's the reason this random 24-ish-year-old is here with you tonight. That and the fact that you have great hospitality and folks here. So without further ado, let me introduce the first easy topic tonight, and the topic of God. So I don't know about you, but for me growing up, God sort of felt like a marble statue. The idea of God was handed down to me through Sunday school, through my parents, through my community. Not necessarily that people said, although sometimes this happened, that this is who God is, but it was just sort of an idea that operated under every conversation we had. When we were talking about God, it felt like we had a shared language of everyone sort of knew the kind of God we were talking about at our church. I don't know if you experienced that here, but that's how it was at my home church. When we think about God, we think of sometimes this guy in the sky that's looking out for you. He's your dear friend, or maybe he's someone you don't want to double cross, someone that will get you if you do the wrong thing. And so for me, when I was growing up, even though I was in a loving hometown church, sometimes that statue felt ominous, right? Like these cold marble eyes were watching me and judging me, and that God was there not necessarily to catch me or to be my friend, but but was also someone that was keeping a score. And so when I think about God, one of the first things is that marble statue. That sometimes my image of God is like a marble statue. And this is a little punchy, but it's time to take that dusty statue of God and smash it, with all holy reverence, of course. So the idea here is not that everything that we think about God is wrong, but that we all have assumptions that we think about God. Things we take for granted that I didn't even know I took for granted, until all of a sudden something in my life made me question and say, oh, where did I get that idea from? When I hear the word God, where do I feel that in my body? And what does it make me feel when I say that word? And why do I feel that way when I hear God? And how do we trace that back and say, where did this come from? Why do I think about God in this way? And is this something I want to keep thinking about God in the future? So I want to hear from you. The first thing that comes to mind when you think about God, what is it? Just raise your hand and shout it out. What's the first thing that comes to mind when you think about God? Love? Love, okay. Friend? Nice. Power. Grace. Well, you've got a great church here. Wow, okay, you've got great answers. That love, grace, power, that's an interesting one to unpack. What's your second thought that comes to mind? What's something that before maybe you came to this church, and I know you've got a great environment here, but what are some things that you think you grew up with thinking about God that you've since done away with? Wrathful, yeah. Judgmental, yeah. Angry? A man. Yeah, God is a man. Yeah, that's one. Lots of things that we think about when we think about God. And so I just want you to sit with that for a second. And for a lot of you, it's clear that, we've all had progressions in our faith. And so to think about that journey of what that was like for you to come from a place of thinking of God as a man and as wrathful to where you are now, to thinking about God perhaps as grace and love. And what was that journey like for you? So as you're thinking about that journey, for me, my journey was about, I use a lot of dance metaphors. I think that's my liberal arts degree coming in again. There were a lot of dance classes there, and we were encouraged to try a little bit of everything. So when I think about God, instead of thinking about a statue, I like to think about my faith as a dance. And so instead of staring at a statue that's one-dimensional and is precise and clear, and I know exactly this about God, I like to think about my relationship with God as finding a rhythm. And the rhythm changes over time and depending on where I am in my life. And so what I love to do is to think about what is in this rhythm with God. So, for example, how does the Bible fit into my relationship with God? And how do I make sense of that? And how do I make sense of my neighbors? How do gay people, myself, fit into my relationship with God? What is that rhythm like for me? Where do I see God in the world? And why do I see God where I see God in the world? Who taught me to see God in those places in the world? Do I still see God in those places? Do I want to see God in those places? Where am I not seeing God in the world? Who told me not to see God in the world? Did someone tell me not to see God in that place? Why? Finding a rhythm and figuring out our own rhythm. And so as we get into this rhythm a bit, we're going to touch on the Bible, and we'll come back to the Bible specifically with LGBTQ plus people later. But for now, just thinking about the Bible as a source of information about God. So there are some things in the Bible, right? It says some things about God, and for a lot of us, we get our ideas about God probably from the Bible. But there are some contradictory things about God in the Bible, right? Some things just don't add up. There are some attributes, and even in some spaces, to say there are contradictory things in the Bible is scandalous. So right there, why do we think that's scandalous? Who taught us that? Does the Bible say that? Does that matter to me? So as we're looking at the sources of God's identity in the Bible, I want us to play a little bit. So I've got a little game. We're going to try some moves. So when we encounter stories in the Bible, for example, the flood, the great flood that we know, that, we're told that Noah built an ark and that all of the people of the earth drowned, and they were the only people in the world that survived. But archaeology tells us that it maybe wasn't the entire world. Maybe it was their world. Maybe it was their community. The Levant, the area, Israel-Palestine, was flooded. And so what do we do with that, though? If the Bible says that the entire world flooded and that God did that, but archaeology tells us that maybe it wasn't the entire world, well, what do we do with that? How do we wrestle with that? So I think we have a choice. Either the Bible is wrong or we're reading it in the wrong way. When we view the Bible instead of as a history book, but as a collection of divinely inspired stories that are trying to reveal a deeper truth, something about the nature of God and humanity, rather than as a history book, then we free ourselves to dance. We're not bogged down in the question of, wow, does it matter if the flood didn't happen? Does that mean the whole Bible's a lie? All of a sudden, we're freed from those questions because it's not about if that necessarily happened, but it's about something deeper. What were the authors trying to tell us about this flood? And what did the community think that God sent that flood for? And what does that say about God? So we're free to move a bit and dance with our idea of God. And so my guiding question when I go into the Bible is, what do the stories in the Bible tell me about the writer's understandings of who God is, rather than what does the Bible say for certain about God? And that's an interesting shift, and I won't force that on anyone, that has to be your guiding question. So that's just my guiding question. What does it tell me about the community of people that sat down and said, these stories really matter to us? These stories matter for a reason, and we want to share them with future generations. Why did those stories matter to them? So that's how I approach the Bible, is trying to figure out what was so important that they thought these stories were worth keeping, and were worth keeping so much so that 2,800 or so years later, we're still reading them. So we're going to dip our toes in, do a little dance here. And so I want to use a passage from the Bible and as an example, see what you think of it. I realize this text is hard to read. I was hoping some of you could read it, but I will turn my back if that's all right, and I'll read it to you. This is our story time. So this text comes from Genesis. And I like to call it the Great Debate. Some of you probably know this scene, right, with Abraham and God, and they're arguing, a debate is happening. And so we'll read this passage, and then I want us to play with it a bit. So it says, the men turned from there and went towards Sodom, where Abraham remained, standing before the Lord. Then Abraham came near to God. So my first question is, where is God? Right? Apparently, God is a figure that Abraham can come near to. So Abraham came near to God and said, will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked? Suppose, Abraham says, there are 50 righteous within the city. Will you sweep them away will you sweep away the place and not forgive it for the 50 righteous who are in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing, to slay the righteous with the wicked, so that the righteous fare as the wicked do. Far be that from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just? And the Lord said, if I find at Sodom 50 righteous people in the city, I will forgive the whole place for their sake. And Abraham continued, well, let me speak upon myself to the Lord, I who am but dust and ashes. And you really get the dramatic flair here, right? Of, let me present myself in all humility before the Lord. Suppose that there are 5 of the 50 are lacking. So what will you do if there are only 45 righteous? And the debate continues. But God, now hear me out here. What about 40? Okay. But what about 35 and 30 and 25 and 20 and 15? And so we get this scene where Abraham is debating with God about the righteous, and Abraham's questioning God's justice and questioning the nature of God. And so I have to wonder, do we think that this happened? Do we want to think that this happened? If we do think that this happened, what does this say about God? That God could debate and be debated with, and it seems to lose a debate with a mortal. But if the Bible's not a history book, does it matter if this debate happened? And if the debate did happen, what does that say about God? Which we already said. A lot of us hold that God is immutable, which is the fancy word for unchangeable. And yet it seems like God changes God's mind. We also believe, a lot of us, that God is perfect. Well, if God's perfect, how could God have gotten it wrong in the first place? And if we believe that God's omniscient, that God can see and knows all things, then why didn't God see this debate happening in the first place? And so we get some real pickles here about what we think about God. And so even though there are some people that would like to say the Bible's very clear that God thinks this about gay people and we believe this about God, and the Bible's very clear about both of them, we see right away from these stories that it's more complex than that. And so the question doesn't become, did this happen? If we read this story as a story written by people who were just like us, trying to figure out God's character, then what does this story tell us about the writer's understanding of God? What do you think the writers were trying to figure out about God? Fairness? Reasonable? Justice? If God is just, how does God uphold God's justice? I think that's a very valid question for us today as we find ourselves in justice movements, right? And so we're forced to wonder, are our justice movements just? What does justice look like? Is the justice system of the U.S. just? What is justice? For whom? And I think we see the same question that we're pondering today being played out 2,800 years ago, of the authors wondering, how many people would God sacrifice? How many good people do there have to be for God to uphold God's justice? What does God's justice look like? It's very clear that they believe God to be just. Abraham says that right away. But how does God fulfill God's justice? How does God keep God's end of the promise? And so I think this is a perfect example of why we have to dance and feel the rhythm, the underlying truth of the stories, rather than staring at that marble statue of literalism. And what's fascinating is that a simple story like this, in a context like this, seems so easy, right? It almost seems so easy. Well, of course, in this setting, that couldn't have happened. But growing up in my good Methodist church, we never had that conversation. How many of you ever had that conversation that maybe these things didn't actually happen? Maybe there's something else going on here. And that conversation isn't supposed to mess up people's faith, take away their faith. It's to invite them to question and to ponder what's underneath all of these ancient stories and rules that we have. It's an invitation to a deeper faith, not to get rid of their faith. And I think for a lot of people, at least in my experience, it's scary. It's scary to have this conversation. So I'm really glad that you all invited me here and that you have this conversation, because this opens up so many possibilities. Suddenly, God isn't someone who we have to be afraid of all the time. Suddenly, God is someone we can think about. God is someone we can be in dialogue with, not just as a friend, but also as an idea. God is someone that we're also figuring out. God's not someone we have all the answers for. Because depending on what image of God someone has in their head, they can justify all sorts of harm, as we've seen throughout history. You know, if God would have done away with the whole city if there were 50 righteous people, we'd have a very different God. But even with the God that we're left with by the authors, that God was willing to do away with the city if there were only 5 righteous people. And what does that leave us with? What kind of God does that leave us with? Is that a God that we think is replicated in the themes and the messages throughout the rest of the Bible? And what do we do with that? How do we work with that? How do we dance with that? And one of the things about God, now I have Macho Man playing in my head, thanks. One of the other ideas about God is that God's a man, God's a macho man. Now, a question I want to have for you as we're taking some threads out of this idea of God, chiseling away slowly, is why could masculine pronouns for God potentially be harmful? Now, to be very clear, I'm not saying that you can't use masculine pronouns for God. I'm not telling you you can't do that. I just want to know, how could that potentially be harmful for some people? Yeah, poor fatherly relationships, maybe abusive fathers. And so having God always only as a father image in church would be harmful. Yeah, thank you. Mm, mm. Yeah, the response was for those online that it would leave a whole group of people, people that identify as women, as less than. Right? God is equated with masculinity, so men become holy and better than women, and human history ensues. Yeah. So my question is, if God's not a human, I think we can all agree on that, right? Except for Jesus. If God's not human, then why do we use pronouns for God? Why has our society said that God is a man? Why is that the only image we often use? Mm. Yeah, that men were in power. It made sense to just keep saying man. Now, this isn't totally negative to use pronouns for God. Why do we use pronouns for God in our faith? Mm. 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 Yeah, so to summarize that, that it's helpful in relationships. Jesus used it to talk about his relationship with God. And for me, that's a key piece, is that we connect with God through pronouns because it makes God someone we can relate to more easily. You know, if I think about God as my father, as my mother, as my friend, then it's easier to be in communication, because how do you approach something that you can't describe? It gives us one avenue of access. And I think what Terry just said is that it's illustrative, not descriptive of, and we'll push into that for a second, of calling God a father is metaphorical language, and metaphorical language is both an is and is not, right? God is like a father means that God has fatherly qualities, but it also means that God is not a father, because it's comparing two things that are not the same. And I think a lot of times, at least in my experience of church, we really highlight the is thing and we don't highlight the is not thing. And so when we're talking about God as a father, we're leaving out that, okay, but God's also not a father. God's also something else. God's something beyond that. And so I think it's important for us to name the pronouns that we use and why we use them. So if you're having a conversation with someone, something that I've adopted is to say, in this setting, I'm going to use pronouns for God because that's how I relate to God. But I understand that God's beyond gender. And I know that sounds kind of, heady, but you can make your own casual way of saying that. But some way to recognize that I'm intentionally and consciously using metaphorical language for God because it's how I relate to God. But I know that God's more than this. And I think that, but I know that God's more than this is often lacking. And that's why we get left with the God who's a man who empowers men and disempowers other people. And so I want to do a little, not game with you, but I want to have another talk back here. So with this image of God, who do you think created it? This one's easier, I know. Who do you think created it? What was we call it their social location, their race, their socioeconomic status? Who do you think created it, and who do you think they created it for? Men by men, we heard. But what kind of men? Yeah, in particular, right? A white Italian man. Yeah. So famous picture, Michelangelo, right? Little art history lesson here, I guess. So Michelangelo, right? And we imagine, for me, I don't know about you, but for a long time I saw this picture, and it was above my parents' bed, of all places. And so for me, when I thought about God, it was only the hands though, so I guess it was kind of cute. When I thought about God, it was this image. And this was the image of God that I had in my mind. It wasn't a painting, it was an image of God. And I think those two are very distinct, and I don't think we make that distinction. Because by saying, here's a representation of God by Michelangelo in the 16th century, we make it very clear that this is someone's interpretation of God, and very clear that this is not the authoritative image of God. And that may seem silly, but for me, that was a big realization to say, this is just someone's interpretation of God, produced by a particular person who happened to paint a God that looks surprisingly like that person and surprisingly like the people who were paying him to do that work. Now, why could this image be harmful? We don't all look like that. Yeah, it casts a very particular image of God that excludes a lot of people. Yeah. So now we're going to go to a second image, and I have the same questions. Who do you think created it, and who do you think they created it for? By women, for women. Yeah. By black women, for black women. Interesting, that they're wearing clothes. Yeah. Yeah, the God figure's wearing clothes in both pictures. Interesting. Yeah, gray hair. God's tired of all of us humans debating. This was right after the Abraham debate. Now, why could this image be empowering? Yeah, because this group of people, in particular black women, haven't been represented in churches. And so there's a big debate going on, as you all probably know, about our pictures of Jesus and our statues of Jesus, and what do we do with those? And, well, does it matter, and why does it matter? And I think, for me, putting these two images side by side really brings to light that our images for God really matter. They impact how we think about ourselves. I mean, to see yourself in the image of God is empowering, especially if no one else sees it in you. And for me as a white person, to see the image of God in black women necessarily changes the way that I see black women.
Historically, we've had such dominant images like Michelangelo painting that dominated everything. Just seeing a different representation, whether it was this one or it could be any other than what he makes us realize it's just a representation. The fact that it's that picture, we all know what Jesus looks like because we have that picture on the wall of church and everywhere else. Because it was dominant.
Yeah. Yeah. The idea of even just seeing a different version of these images is empowering and impactful, because it dislodges our certainty about who we think of when we think of God right away. And so this picture, by the way, is by Harmonia Rosales, who you can find on Instagram. And so out of all of this, I hope that you've seen that naming is essential to the process of deconstruction. Naming why we say what we say and why we use the images we use invites people to question their own assumptions. It leaves room where faith isn't something that's necessarily handed down in a neat booklet, but is something that we're all figuring out together and that we're all free to question. And so saying in this song today, we're going to say God as a father, but we understand that God is more than that. We want you to know that. That's something that could be implemented. That would be powerful. Saying we're using these images of God today. We know God has many faces and many experiences of God that can be had. And so we're using this one today, but we want you to know that there are more of them out there. And we want to hear from you how you think of God. That can be powerful and impactful. And so maybe your image of God changed a little bit from this short thing. Maybe we shook some certainty loose a bit. So some questions to just keep on the mind as you leave from this place is, how has your image of God changed at all, if it did? What certainty loosened up a bit? What pronouns will you use for the divine? How will you introduce the way that you use pronouns for God? Will you? Does it matter to you? Why does it matter? Why doesn't it matter to you? And how can you continue to deconstruct the images of God that you have in your mind and that you have all around you? How might you change the images that you surround yourself with of God? This is something I'm always working on. And very briefly, because, you invite the gay person here to talk about the gay stuff in the Bible, so we'll get to it very briefly. But for more of this, it's in the book Reclaiming Church, which is for sale outside. So we'll just touch very briefly on the language here. So finding the beams, and we already talked about this a bit, that when I approach the Bible, sometimes as an angsty youth, I was tempted to go in swinging with a Louisville slugger. How about that? And just whacking it all apart. And, the Bible, this isn't true, so how can we say any of it's true? Just throw it all out. My good Methodist upbringing never actually let me feel like that, but I don't know. I met some people that were like that, and maybe some of you were like that. And deep down, why do we even have to deal with this thing? But for me, it's what we're doing is not only taking apart harmful uses of Scripture or just assumptions and generalizations about what Scripture says, but we're also building up a church from what we find underneath, a church where everyone belongs and dances together. So my hope is, and I hope that you saw this morning by using the Bible to justify the inclusion of LGBTQ plus people, is to say that the Bible is still a sacred resource for me. And I've seen that it's a sacred resource for you as well. That we are deconstructing and taking apart harmful usages of the Bible. We're not getting rid of the Bible. We're questioning and interacting with and moving deeper into conversation with the Bible. We're not dismissing it. And I think that's an assumption that gets lost in this debate a lot of times, that someone's biblical and someone's a non-biblical progressive person. So some language that's involved there is traditionalist. I don't know about you, but I hear this language a lot. I'm a traditionalist. Well, a traditionalist is simply someone that advocates for maintaining tradition. And I love tradition. Give me a high church service any day. If I wear robes, I'm in heaven. I know, that's not everyone's cup of tea. So I got, for me, when I'm approaching this conversation, I like to take that word out, to say, no one gets to claim that word because there are progressive traditionalists and there are other traditionalists. There are lots of people that can claim the word traditionalist. Same with conservative. I heard earlier today, you have fiscally conservative people that are socially progressive. And conservatism, right, someone who holds on to traditional values, sometimes averse to change. And so I know plenty of people that are socially progressive but fiscally conservative. And so I like to take that word out of the conversation. I can't say I'm perfect about doing that. But I like to take that out to make this no longer a conservative progressive debate. Same with biblical. On my very liberal campus in undergrad, we had, surprisingly, someone that was affiliated with Campus Crusades for Christ, rebranded as Crew. And as we were having this conversation as an impressionable freshman, first year in college, she was explaining her views as a biblical view, and other people's views as revisionist, somehow people that weren't steeped in the Bible. And so I like to take that word out of this conversation because it's clear by now that we all can claim to be biblical in our views. So what I like to say is, well, let's really get down to the heart of the problem. Christians that use the Bible to exclude. Exclusionary. So as I'm talking about the LGBTQ discussion and debate, I won't refer to conservative and progressive people. I'll say exclusive or exclusionary Christians, people that use the Bible to exclude. And so right away, that changes the footing that we're all on. All of a sudden, the debate isn't pre-decided beforehand that one view is biblical or traditional and one view isn't. And we're not stacking conservatives and progressives against each other. We're stacking, or we're naming the facts that some people are using the Bible to exclude other people. So let's get into the facts very briefly. Exclusionary Christians like to say that sodomy was always in the Bible. Sodom and Gomorrah is clearly about the gays, right? Sodomy. That's where it comes from. But what if I told you, as Reclaiming Church will tell you, that the word Sodom wasn't invented until the year 1049? Would that surprise you? You can raise your hand. It surprised me when I found that out, that the word sodomy didn't exist when the story of Sodom and Gomorrah was being written. It didn't exist for over 1,000 years until after that story. In 1049, in this tiny book called the Book of Gomorrah, I like to call him a bitter Benedictine monk, Peter Damian, and the Pope at the time saw this book and said, "This is silly." Obviously, that's a paraphrase, but it wasn't taken seriously. So what's important to know is that around this time was also a great sexual, the church was attempting to crack down on their sexual ethics. Priests had concubines up until this time, and even a little after this. Priests had concubines and wives, and so it's during this 11th century time that the church was trying to hone in on its sexual ethic to say, maybe our priests need to be celibate so that their property can't be gifted to their sons, so that their sons can't take the land from the church. Interesting state and church and politics. And so it's around this time that the church is overwhelmed in thinking about sex and how sex and power go together and sex and land and wealth go together. That Peter Damian coins this word sodomy simply by adding a Greek ending to the Hebrew name of the city, Sodom. And that's how we get the word sodomy. So it wasn't until the 11th century. So there's a little factoid for you to share with your friends. So some questions from that is, if sodomy and therefore sodomite wasn't a word until 1049, how can exclusionary Christians claim that the Bible was always against it? Why do so many people believe that sodomy is written in the Bible? And if Sodom and Gomorrah isn't about sodomy, what is it about? You can check Ezekiel 16 for that one. Apathy. Okay, and the next word, our last word, is homosexual. More recent word. When, 1869, ironically, in a German pamphlet that was arguing in favor of same-sex people, he coined this word by adding the Greek word homos, the same, to the Latin root sexualis. And so that wasn't until the 19th century, and the first time it's used in the Bible was 1946. Now, how many of you does that surprise? The first time homosexuality was ever written in the Bible is 1946, which, by the way, right at the end of the World War, the second one, during which time Hitler was also bringing gay people to the concentration camps, and the LGBTQ community wasn't officially recognized as victims of the Holocaust until the 90s. But it's very clear that there was a culture of homophobia that was happening. And so it's in the midst of this, as Hitler's rounding up all the Jews and the gays and putting them in camps, we have people that are religious studies people adding this sentiment that's going around for the first time ever into the Bible, adding homosexuality into the Bible. And so the questions again are, if homosexual and therefore homosexuality was not a word until 1869 and wasn't in the Bible until 1946, how can exclusionary Christians claim the Bible is against it? Why do so many people believe that the word homosexuality was always in the Bible? And if Sodom and Gomorrah, again, isn't about homosexuality, then what is it about? Very brief overview, I know. Not answering all of your questions, I know. But we're going to leave the language debate there so that we can all continue to engage with this. Because there aren't clear answers for any of this. It's all part of the way that we dance and find our rhythm of faith with the divine. And I think it's important. The language debate really brings up for me the importance of naming the fact that so many things we say and do in church and see in church aren't certain. For a lot of people, like me, I believed that sodomy and homosexuality was always in the Bible. No one ever thought to mention, of course, that the Bible's a translation and that the translation changed over time. I mean, that seems like common knowledge. Of course the Bible's a translation. Of course as language changes, it changes over time. But it does something to us to have that in our consciousness when we're hearing the Bible, to know that these words were chosen by particular people within particular contexts. It makes everything a little less certain, at least for me. And that uncertainty doesn't wreck my faith. It invites me into it in a more meaningful way. Suddenly I'm more of a participant in my faith and not just a receiver of something. So naming the things that we use, including our translations of the Bible. And so with that fire hose of information, we now turn to a time where we can, anything that you're thinking about from this, any other questions you have, we can talk, and feel free if you have answers or responses to questions that people have to share them, because there's collective wisdom in the room. So I know that was a lot. I'm grateful that you were here and that you sat for the whole thing of it. We narrowed it down to an hour to try and get everyone out of here in a safe way. So we had to boil it down a bit. But I'm glad that we got to spend this time together. So, what questions are still percolating on your mind? Or what things do you think are important? Or what ideas do you want to use in the future? I think, yeah, that's a great question. So, the question was, are there churches or denominations that don't allow these type of questions? I can't say for certain on a whole as denominations, but I know there are definitely churches where this is taboo. I mean, even to mention that, did Abraham really debate with God would be, sacrilegious. How could you think that that didn't happen? Yeah, yeah.
I think, JJ, what's important to some denominations have taken formal positions
Mm,
and basically closed the opportunity for questions
mm,
because they've decided it's this way. So
mm,
somebody may ask the question, but it's not going to be entertained. It's not going to be discussed because
mm,
they've decided.
mm. So the response was that some denominations have, official stances that we believe the Bible is the inerrant word of God, and that wording matters. And I think that's still a touchy subject. Is if I can't say it's the inerrant word of God, am I wrong? Am I, you're thrown into an out group, and what does that mean? What does inerrant mean? Could you say that again? I'm 50 miles from the Creation Museum. Oh, yes. You have a reconstruction of Noah's Ark, right? What? Interesting. They're getting ready to build the Tower of Babel. Well, that didn't work out so well the first time, so I'm interested to see how it goes this time. Interesting. The dinosaurs are on the ark. Wow. Wow. Yeah. You mean there were no three? What happened? Yeah, I think that really ties back into your question of do people, do we still, is it possible to entertain these questions? And thank you for that context. I mean, that tells me right away that if they built the ark following the specifications that are in there, it's pretty certain they believe it happened exactly as it was said. That's a good question. Yeah, the question was, why was this added in and which version? So the version, and it's my favorite version actually, the Revised Standard Version, though now we have the new Revised Standard Version. But it was the Revised Standard Version that first added the word in 1946. Mm. point was that, what book was that again? Okay, yeah. The Roman Empire Emperor Hadrian writing about how people could just have sex with whoever they wanted and love whoever they wanted. And I think what gender studies has taught us is that in ancient Rome and Greece, it didn't matter necessarily the gender or the sex of the partner. What mattered in most cases was the position. So if you were a free man, you could have sex with your male slave or your female slave. It really didn't matter. It was as long as you were the free man, it didn't matter the partner. It was the position, that you were the person in power. And so it's interesting now to have language and community and to now it be about the person and not the position or the power. Yeah. Great question. So for our folks online, the question was how did I leave the anger and bitterness behind after being, rejected by the church and having folks not be welcoming? And I think a lot of it comes back to my experience in my small town church I didn't know I was gay. I knew I was different, but being gay didn't exist. It just wasn't something that existed. It wasn't a word I knew there was. And so I knew I was different, but I didn't know what. And I didn't know there was a word for it. And so with my hometown church, no one said gay people suck. You can't be here. But no one also said that gay people are welcome. And so even though it wasn't outright hostile, it wasn't a place that I necessarily felt like, yeah, I can come into my own. I can figure out who I am here. And in that place, I think I had really great relationships with the church. And so it was really my family. And I think my family, my biological family, represents a microcosm of the church because half of them are Trump-supporting Republicans. And somehow we have family reunions, and they don't always end badly. And so I've had to figure out, and we've had to figure out, how do we navigate those relationships? And for me, it really has been an exercise in empathy. In one, knowing that these people that are telling me I'm not okay are also people that I grew up with. And so on the one hand, it also changes their response to me because they know me. I'm not just an issue. I'm JJ, the kid we saw in Sunday school, and the kid that sang and leads youth group, and all that jazz. And so I felt like I grew up in a place where we were living the tension of how do we figure this out together? So people were at least willing to have the conversation when I was confident enough to have it. And I think that made a big difference for me. The fact that my home church didn't completely write me off, but that they made space to have conversation. And so I think that's probably the main reason I'm still here. Is it wasn't a total write-off. It was, okay, you're still that kid that we grew up with and loved, and you're still part of this community, and how do we journey through this together and figure this out? And so I think that was really instrumental. And so I definitely don't think staying is always the safest option for everyone. Definitely, if it's a hostile place, then do what you need to do to find safety. But I was lucky to have people who were willing to have a conversation. Yeah. And people that were willing to have the conversation for me before I was ready to have the conversation. And so it wasn't all of the pressure isn't all of a sudden on a young person who's figuring this self out myself, There were people that were willing to have the conversation on my behalf. Yeah. Yeah, so in the book I talk about coming out with my dad in the car ride home from college. And yeah, it was, not what I expected from a Trump supporting Republican. To our conversation was, Jay, if you're gay, that's okay. And obviously, neither of us had it all figured out at that point. And so we both were willing, though, to have those conversations in the car. And slowly, it's been fun to watch both my parents evolve in their understanding and change. And my mom grew up Catholic. And of course, she had her ideas. I was lucky enough, fortunate enough that she loved me, and that was the first thing she said. She didn't understand everything, as no one does right away. But now, she proudly goes to every church with a name tag on that says JJ's mom. And she's out there on her First 5 Bible app. I don't know if any of you have that. And if someone says something hateful, about gay people, she'll be the first one to say, I don't know if the Bible really says that, and maybe we should talk about that more. So it's been really fun to see that progression as well of when we have relationships with people, the power that can happen. Yeah. It's called First 5. But another Bible app I recommend is called Our Bible app, which is all run and owned by a queer woman of color. And it's all young, queer and people of color and different activists creating Bible studies on there, called Our Bible app, if you want some progressive or activist-oriented faith resources. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that question. So the question was that 3-minute speech, how did that change my calling, my trajectory, and what was its impact on me? And I think it gave me an opportunity that I wasn't looking for, to be able to, in Methodist churches, we talk a lot about the connection. And I've heard a bit about that as well from Meredith, talking about the folks that you know in your denomination, and how you feel connected to them. And so Methodist, that's a real big thing. We like to say we're a connectional church. We're a global connection. It goes all around the world, and we're in relationship together. And for me, it was a moment where I felt the global church in that moment. After that speech, there were young kids in Kenya that reached out to me that said, that was really powerful, and that makes me feel like I want to stay in this church and fight here in Kenya. And kids in Norway that were like, I'm gay, and this means a lot that we're in the same church. And so, if anything, that moment really helped me to experience the beauty of the connection of denominations. That, as laden with issues as we are, there's a power in being a global people and knowing that there are folks around the world in your corner, that you're all working towards something together. And I think that also textured my calling a bit, in that I feel called to working with that a bit more of what does it look like to engage with people around the world in this conversation, so that, it's not only the churches in the U.S. that will be LGBTQ accepting, but how do I have dialogues with people outside the U.S., and how do we form relationships that aren't, me telling you what to do, but relationships where we're both learning, and what does that look like for the future? So yeah, I think it really made my feeling, my calling of ministry, it widened the scope, and it's been really exciting and fun and joy-filled to see people around the world and get to make connections. And yeah. Exactly, yeah. Well, good. Thank you all so much for spending this evening with me. It's been a pleasure to be here in Louisville. And tell me if I say that right. And I'm glad. I'm glad that you all are doing the work here. I know I get to pop in for a weekend and pop out, so it means a lot that you all have been here doing this for decades and that you're still having this conversation and naming it because we know that that matters. So it's been a joy, and I gladly return the microphone to Terry.